With his angelic smile and signature red hair, Johnny Whitaker was once a massive cash cow for the Disney empire in the 1970s. Yet, his most brutal tragedy wasn't written in a script. It was engineered by the ecosystem of adults surrounding him, monetized since childhood and drained by his own family's greed. America's golden boy lost absolutely everything the moment puberty hit. The shock of being exploited and subsequently discarded pushed Johnny from the heights of Hollywood straight to the bottom of society, spending 12 agonizing years as a homeless addict, drowning in hard narcotics. The making of this human commodity began long before his brain had fully developed the capacity to comprehend the transaction he was entering. Born in December 1959 in California, Johnny was brought into a world where appearances were about to become the primary currency of his existence. He possessed a face that commanded immediate attention. It was not just that he was cute. He had the kind of highly readable emotive features that casting directors spend their careers hunting for. He had wide, expressive eyes that could brim with tears on command, and a cheeky, gap-toothed grin that suggested a harmless, endearing mischief. In the proximity of the Hollywood studio system, that specific configuration of facial features is not viewed as a biological trait. It is viewed as an unexploited natural resource. He was put to work at the age of 3. Most children at that age are learning the boundaries of their physical world through unstructured play, making mistakes and seeking unconditional comfort. Johnny was learning the rigid boundaries of a sound stage. He was learning to hit a taped mark on the floor, to stare unblinking into the black, mechanical lens of a camera, and to manufacture complex emotional states in exchange for the approval of strange adults holding clipboards. This is the foundational psychological trauma of the working child. The early devastating realization that love, validation, and safety are not innate rights, but conditional commodities that must be actively earned through continuous performance. If he smiled correctly, hit his mark, and delivered the line, the adults were pleased. The director yelled "cut," and the massive machinery of the set hummed along. If he failed, if he acted like a normal, tired 3-year-old, he cost the production thousands of dollars in wasted time. He was a toddler, carrying the fiscal responsibility of a corporate executive. By 1966, the American television landscape was a battlefield for ratings and advertising dominance. CBS was looking for a flagship weapon to capture the highly coveted family demographic. They conceptualized Family Affair, a sitcom engineered with the precision of a psychological operation. The premise centered on a wealthy, carefree bachelor living in a luxurious Manhattan penthouse whose life is suddenly upended when he is forced to take in his brother's orphan children. It was a brilliant, highly manipulative narrative construct. It offered the audience visual luxury, the warmth of surrogate parenting, and the undeniable primal emotional hook of children who had suffered a profound, tragic loss. The network cast the gruff, dependable Brian Keith as Uncle Bill and the distinctly formal Sebastian Cabot as the fastidious manservant Mr. French. But the entire emotional weight of the multi-million-dollar enterprise rested squarely on the narrow shoulders of the children. They needed a boy who could convey deep vulnerability without being cloying, and boyish mischief without seeming malicious. They needed the perfect Jody. When 7-year-old Johnny Whitaker walked into the audition room, the search was instantly terminated. He did not have to act like a boy desperately in need of a father figure. His natural, eager-to-please demeanor projected a hunger for affection that the camera magnified 1,000-fold. The executives behind the mahogany desk did not look at Johnny and see a talented first grader. They saw a broadcast strategy. They saw a face that could move millions of dollars in advertising revenue for cereal companies and toy manufacturers. When Family Affair premiered, the reaction was instantaneous, massive, and culturally overwhelming. It became a television monolith, anchoring the network's primetime schedule and drawing tens of millions of viewers into its artificial warmth every single week. The chemistry between Johnny and his on-screen sister, Anissa Jones, was the emotional engine that drove the show's massive success. But the sheer scale of the fame that descended upon Johnny was something the human brain is not biologically equipped to process, let alone the developing fragile brain of a 7-year-old boy. Overnight, the concept of a normal childhood evaporated. He ceased to be a private citizen and became public property. He could not walk down a suburban street, visit a public park, or go to a grocery store without being mobbed by strangers. Grown adults felt entirely entitled to cross physical boundaries, to touch him, to pick him up, to pull his hair, and to demand that he perform the character of Jody right there on the concrete pavement. The critical boundary between Johnny Whitaker, the boy, and Jody, the consumable product, was violently erased by the public's insatiable appetite for the illusion he provided. He was living inside a bizarre, hermetically sealed bubble of surveillance and adulation. His days were spent in windowless studios, under hot, blinding lights, surrounded by union crew members, makeup artists, and directors who were paid to manage him like a piece of high-end equipment. His education, the fundamental right of any child, was reduced to a legal nuisance, squeezed into 15-minute increments mandated by California state law. These lessons were delivered by studio teachers whose primary objective, dictated by the studio hierarchy, was not to foster intellectual curiosity or emotional growth, but to ensure the production schedule was never interrupted by something as trivial as a math lesson. As the show reached the zenith of its popularity, the financial dynamics surrounding the Whitaker boy underwent a catastrophic, irreversible shift. Before the television cameras invaded their lives, his family existed within the standard parameters of a large, middle-class household. After Family Affair became a syndicated juggernaut, 7-year-old Johnny was generating more wealth in a single week than many adults would see in a decade of hard labor. This inversion of the natural domestic hierarchy is a toxic dynamic that has systematically destroyed the psychological foundations of countless child stars. When a first grader becomes the primary economic engine for an entire network of adults, the parents are forced into a terrible compromise. They cease to be uncompromised protectors and inevitably morph into employees, managers, and wardens of the golden goose. The strict discipline, the boundary setting, and the unconditional love required to raise a healthy, functional human being are fatally compromised by the desperate underlying need to keep the revenue stream flowing at all costs. You cannot ground the person paying the mortgage. You cannot discipline the child whose smile secures the financial future of the entire household. The boy who was pretending to be a helpless orphan on television was in reality the most powerful and simultaneously the most powerless individual in his own life. He was generating a fortune, yet he was still subject to bedtimes and allowances. The seeds of the ultimate betrayal were sown in this financial distortion, setting the stage for a bitter harvest that would eventually strip him of his wealth, his sanity, and very nearly his life. The Coogan Law, designed to act as a fiduciary shield for minors, mandated that a specific percentage of a child actor's earnings be placed into a blocked trust account. The public assumed Johnny was a minted millionaire, set for life. The reality was far more parasitic. While a fraction of his wealth was sequestered, the remaining 85% flowed directly into the control of his parents, agents, and business managers. The law did nothing to regulate the extravagant lifestyle inflation that inherently infects the families of the sudden massively wealthy. Johnny's earnings funded a microeconomy for a household of 8 children. The money he bled for on the sound stages paid for the larger house, the better cars, and their elevated social status. He was told that the money was for the family, a phrase that transformed his grueling work schedule into an act of filial duty. Johnny was not just memorizing lines. He was carrying the mortgage and the financial anxiety of an entire dynasty on his small, freckled shoulders. As the 1960s transitioned into the 1970s, Johnny Whitaker's value as a corporate asset expanded exponentially beyond the confines of CBS. The Walt Disney Company, an empire built upon the relentless monetization of childhood innocence, recognized the boy's unique, highly sanitized appeal. Disney did not merely want to rent his face for a weekly sitcom. They wanted to absorb him into their corporate machinery, utilizing him as the undisputed face of their live-action theatrical division. He was cast as the lead in a string of wholesome, family-friendly films like The Biscuit Eater and Snowball Express. To the audience, this seemed like a natural, joyful progression of a talented young boy's career. But behind the gates of the studio, Johnny was being deployed as a strategic weapon in a multi-million-dollar corporate war for box office supremacy. The Disney machine of that era was unparalleled in its ability to manufacture, market, and merchandise its human assets. Johnny was flown across the globe on grueling promotional tours, paraded before the press, and contractually obligated to project a perpetual, unwavering state of boyish delight. He was smiling on movie posters. His face was printed on lunchboxes, and his voice was recorded for commercial tie-ins. He was a millionaire, a global icon, and a deeply entrenched brand. Yet beneath the veneer of this cinematic utopia, the psychological toll of this commodification was compounding daily. He was a child living in a state of constant high-stakes performance, terrified of making a mistake that could jeopardize the massive financial apparatus operating above his head. He learned to suppress his own authentic emotions, the natural fatigue, frustration, and rebellion of growing up, because authentic emotions are unpredictable, and predictability is the cornerstone of corporate investments. He was an employee masquerading as a child, surrounded by executives who praised his professionalism, but had absolutely no vested interest in his long-term psychological survival. They loved the revenue he generated, but they were fundamentally terrified of his biology, knowing that the very thing that made him valuable, His prepubescent innocence was a rapidly depreciating asset with a hard, unalterable expiration date. The fundamental problem for any child star is simple biology. They inevitably grow up, shedding the very physical attributes that made them marketable. By the time Family Affair was unceremoniously canceled in 1971, falling victim to the network's ruthless rural purge, which sought to replace gentle family comedies with edgier urban-centric programming, Johnny was standing on the precipice of adolescence. The cancellation itself was a brutal, sudden psychological shock. The surrogate family he had spent 5 years with, the daily rigid routine that had defined his entire conscious existence, vanished overnight with a single memo from the network executives in New York. There was no emotional closure, no psychological debriefing, only the sudden deafening silence of a disconnected sound stage. He was sent back to his real family, a family that had grown profoundly dependent on the income of a show that no longer existed, a family now staring down the barrel of a drastically reduced financial future. And then the ultimate biological betrayal began. The transition from childhood to adolescence is an awkward, physically uncomfortable, and emotionally volatile period for any human being, but for a child whose entire net worth is tied to his physical appearance, puberty is a professional death sentence. Johnny's voice, the high sweet pitch that had delivered punchlines to millions, began to crack and drop in register. The round, cherubic softness of his face, the baby fat that the camera had loved so dearly, began to stretch and lengthen into the sharp, unrefined angles of a teenager. He was growing taller, his limbs becoming gangly and uncoordinated. He was no longer the adorable pocket-sized Jody. He was a gawky, transitional adolescent, trapped in the physical purgatory between the child he was and the man he was becoming. Hollywood's reaction to this natural evolution was immediate, clinical, and devastatingly cruel. The phone, which had once rung incessantly with offers from the most powerful producers in the world, simply stopped ringing. The studio executives who had previously fawned over him, who had sent him lavish gifts and promised him a lifetime of cinematic glory, now looked right through him as if he were a ghost. He had aged out of his own marketability. He was experiencing a brutal, undeniable professional death at an age when most young people are only just beginning to figure out their basic identities. The psychological devastation of this rejection cannot be overstated. When a child has been trained since the age of 3 that his fundamental worth as a human being is inextricably linked to his ability to secure acting roles, the sudden cessation of those roles is interpreted not as a career lull, but as a total catastrophic rejection of his very soul. He walked into casting offices, his teenage body betraying him, only to see the palpable disappointment in the eyes of the casting directors. They did not want Johnny Whitaker, the evolving actor. They wanted the ghost of Jody, the static image of 1960s innocence. And Johnny could no longer conjure that illusion. He was forced to apologize for the biological crime of growing up. This sudden, violent loss of relevance was immediately compounded by the terrifying financial reckoning taking place within his own home. The lucrative Disney contracts dried up. The massive influx of cash slowed to a meager trickle of syndicated residuals, and the lifestyle that the family had built upon the foundation of his childhood labor began to crumble. The underlying tension in the household, previously concealed by the sheer volume of wealth, exploded into the open with terrifying ferocity. The narrative of the supportive, loving family, the image they had projected to the magazines and the public, shattered under the immense pressure of financial scarcity. The money was gone. The millions of dollars that Johnny had sacrificed his childhood to earn, the wealth that was supposed to secure his future and validate his grueling labor, had largely evaporated into the ether of bad investments, lifestyle maintenance, and the exorbitant fees of the adults who had managed him. The realization that he had worked exhaustively for a decade only to be left with a fraction of his worth is a psychological trauma that fundamentally alters a young person's capacity for trust. Bitter, protracted disputes over money, control, and the past mismanagement of his earnings turned the Whitaker household into a toxic battlefield. The boy who had spent his most formative years pretending to be part of a perfectly harmonious, wealthy family on television now found himself trapped in a profoundly broken, financially desperate one in reality. He realized with the crushing, cynical clarity of a forced adulthood that he had been the victim of a systemic, legalized form of child exploitation. His childhood had been monetized, his earnings had been squandered or fought over by the very people tasked with his protection. And now that the product had expired, he was left entirely alone to navigate the emotional and financial wreckage. He was a depreciated asset, discarded by the studio system that had created him, and profoundly alienated from the family that had lived off him. The foundation of his identity had been built on a transactional form of love, and as the transaction ceased, so too did the illusion of safety, leaving him standing on the edge of a vast, terrifying abyss, searching desperately for a sanctuary that did not exist. For incision from the golden child of the 60s to an obsolete teenager permanently shattered his capacity for trust. The Hollywood machinery had extracted his youth, and the sheer weight of managing a child millionaire had left his family financially and emotionally fractured, trapped in the sprawling, suffocating geography of Los Angeles, a city that physically maps the hierarchy of success and failure on every street corner. Johnny found himself suffocating under the weight of his own phantom legacy. Every billboard, every studio lot he drove past was a towering concrete reminder of a kingdom from which he had been permanently exiled. Desperate to escape the claustrophobic proximity of his former glory and the bitter transactional nature of his family's financial disputes, he sought a geographical and spiritual sanctuary as far removed from the entertainment industry as geographically possible. Relying on the devout Mormon faith of his upbringing, a framework that offered rigid, predictable rules in a life that had been defined by chaotic exploitation, Johnny made the radical decision to leave the country. He traveled to Portugal to serve as a missionary for his church. This was not merely a religious obligation, it was a desperate, psychological evacuation. He was seeking a spiritual cleansing, a complete immersion into a life where his value was derived from his devotion to a higher power, rather than his ability to generate Nielsen ratings or box office returns. For 2 years, he walked the cobbled streets of a foreign country, stripped of his celebrity, speaking a different language, attempting to forge an identity that was entirely disconnected from the boy with the red hair and the gap-toothed smile. He wanted to be a nameless servant, trading the artificial light of the sound stages for the blinding, anonymous sun of the Iberian Peninsula. Yet the fundamental tragedy of the geographical cure is that the architecture of one's trauma is not left behind at the departure gate. It is packed neatly into the carry-on luggage of the subconscious, waiting to be unpacked the moment the traveler returns home. When Johnny's mission ended and he returned to the United States, the temporary anesthesia of his religious exile rapidly wore off. The Los Angeles he returned to had completely moved on, the industry operating with its usual terrifying amnesia. He was no longer even a fading child star. He was a civilian, a young man with a massive, unfillable gap in his resume, and a bank account that reflected none of the labor of his first decade on Earth. Realizing that the doors of the studios were permanently locked from the inside, Johnny made a conscious, determined effort to construct a conventional, pedestrian existence. He attended university, attempting to sit in lecture halls alongside peers who had spent their childhoods playing in backyards, while he had been carrying the financial burden of an entire production crew. He tried to blend into the mundane fabric of regular society, desperately seeking the safety of the ordinary. In this frantic pursuit of normalcy, he found what he believed to be his ultimate salvation, a woman named Cimbria Wright. She was not an actress. She was a childhood sweetheart, a woman who had known him before the crushing weight of his fame had entirely distorted his reality. To Johnny, Cimbria represented the ultimate, undeniable proof of his own humanity. She was the anchor that would tether him to the real world. By marrying her, he was not just entering a legal contract of matrimony. He was desperately trying to build a new, impenetrable family unit to replace the one that had been shattered by the corrosive effects of his childhood wealth. He invested the entirety of his fragile, battered ego into this relationship, viewing his marriage as a fortress against the predatory nature of the world. He believed that if he could just be a good husband, a normal provider, and a faithful partner, the ghosts of CBS and Disney would finally leave him in peace. For a time, the illusion held. The marriage provided a structural framework that mimicked safety. He started a business, utilizing his name recognition to try and forge a career as a talent agent and consultant, attempting to navigate the periphery of the industry that had rejected him from its center. But the foundation upon which he was building this new life was fundamentally compromised by the unaddressed, festering trauma of his past. The deep-seated resentment of his stolen youth, the profound paralyzing trust issues born of financial exploitation, and the lingering silent humiliation of Hollywood's rejection created a highly volatile internal landscape. He was a man desperately pantomiming normalcy, holding the pieces of his shattered psyche together with the sheer force of his will and the conditional stability of his marriage. In 1988, the fragile stability he had built completely collapsed. Cimbria, the wife he had trusted to love the man instead of the product, filed for divorce. The dissolution of his marriage was devastating enough, but the true horror lay in the specific architecture of her departure. She did not just leave him, she left him to marry his absolute best friend. This was the man who had stood beside him at the altar, the man who had thrown his bachelor party, the confidant to whom Johnny had likely poured out the deepest, darkest insecurities of his ruined childhood. The betrayal was intimate and absolute, for a man whose entire life had been a lesson in the conditional nature of love. This dual betrayal validated every cynical fear the industry had ever planted in his mind. It proved to his fragile, traumatized brain that the world was fundamentally, inherently predatory. It confirmed that he was fundamentally unlovable, that loyalty was an elaborate, cruel lie, and that anyone who claimed to care for him was ultimately just a sleeper agent waiting for the perfect moment to strip him of whatever he had left. The studio had taken his childhood, his family had allegedly taken his money, and now The two people he trusted most in the entire world had taken his dignity and his sanctuary. After a decade of mounting pressure, carrying his family's finances, and surviving Hollywood's immediate rejection, the psychological structure of Johnny Whitaker finally snapped. He simply surrendered. The pain of the divorce and the betrayal was too vast, too complex, and too sharp to process with a sober mind. He needed an immediate mechanism to shut down his consciousness, a chemical barrier to block out the sharp reality of his existence. He found his first socially acceptable solvent at the bottom of a bottle. Alcohol is the standard, ubiquitous entry point for the traumatized. It is legal. It is available on every street corner, and it effectively blurs the terrifying, sharp edges of a waking nightmare. It dulled the sting of the memories, the phantom echo of the studio audience's laughter, and the visceral, sickening humiliation of his best friend walking away with his wife. But alcohol is a blunt, sloppy instrument. For a pain as intricate, as deeply rooted, and as catastrophic as the one tearing through Johnny's nervous system, a more precise, devastating chemical intervention was eventually required. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, a decade characterized by a booming, cynical pop culture that had absolutely no use for the earnest nostalgia of a ginger-haired child star, Johnny Whitaker vanished into the darkest, most unforgiving shadows of Los Angeles. The transition from the legal numbness of heavy drinking to the illicit, all-consuming oblivion of hard narcotics is rarely a sudden cliff drop. It is a gradual, insidious sloping gradient that accelerates as the pain deepens. The city of Los Angeles, the very metropolis that had painstakingly constructed him as a global icon, was now perfectly equipped to dismantle himself or sell. He transitioned to hard narcotics with a singular purpose: total erasure. For a man who had spent his life navigating the manipulative demands of studio executives and family members, the brutal transaction of addiction provided a synthetic, devastating escape from his reality. This period of his life, stretching into a 12-year descent into severe addiction, constitutes the darkest chapter of his narrative. The sheer physical contrast between his broadcasted childhood and his present reality was stark and unavoidable. This was Jody. This was the boy who had sat on Uncle Bill's lap, clutching a pristine baseball glove, radiating an innocence so pure it felt weaponized by the CBS network. Now that same face, weathered by unimaginable stress, hollowed out by malnutrition, and ravaged by the corrosive effects of heavy narcotics, was navigating the grim, unforgiving underbelly of Southern California. His remaining funds, already severely depleted by past mismanagement, were now rapidly drained from his accounts to feed an exponentially escalating habit. The Hollywood child star is a uniquely tragic figure in the landscape of severe addiction because their starting point is so extraordinarily, artificially high. The distance between the penthouse suites of their youth and the concrete pavement of their adulthood is vast, and the terminal velocity of their fall is terrifying to witness. Johnny lost his remaining businesses, he lost his meager savings, and he eventually lost his grip on the conventional housed world entirely. He entered a ghostly, transient existence, drifting from the couches of enablers to cheap, infested motels, and ultimately to the very streets themselves. The former crown prince of the Disney live-action empire was now effectively homeless, destitute, and shivering in the California night. He was living rough in the exact same geographical area where he used to be chauffeured in studio limousines, flanked by security guards and publicists. He walked a ragged and broken man past the very studio gates and sound stages where he had sacrificed the foundational years of his youth. He was now just another anonymous broken variable in the city's sprawling homelessness crisis. The hypocrisy of the system was absolute. The entertainment industry demands that its child actors project an aura of invulnerability, perpetual joy, and flawless perfection, yet it provides them with zero psychological infrastructure to survive the fallout when the cameras inevitably stop rolling and the public loses interest. When a former child star falls into the abyss of addiction, the reaction of the general public is rarely empathetic. It is typically characterized by a mixture of morbid, voyeuristic fascination and a smug moral superiority. They are treated not as human beings in the throes of a deadly disease, but as cautionary tales, punchlines in tabloid magazines, and punchy headlines for late-night comedians. They are viewed as having squandered a lottery ticket, rather than being the victims of a highly unregulated, deeply exploitative labor system that broke their minds before they were old enough to drive. For 12 excruciating years, Johnny lived in this punishing, relentless exile. 12 years is not a brief stumble. It is an entire era of human life. It is more than 4,000 days of waking up with the physical, bone-crushing agony of withdrawal, of compromising every single moral and ethical standard just to secure the next chemical fix, of watching the physical body slowly cannibalize its own organs to survive the daily toxic load. The torment of his 12-year addiction was compounded by the inescapable curse of his visual legacy. Unlike a regular citizen falling into vagrancy, Johnny carried the ghost of his famous childhood mapped across his face. Even ravaged by drugs, his underlying features would occasionally trigger recognition in passing strangers. To be approached by someone looking at his ragged clothes and hollowed cheeks, asking with invasive curiosity, "Aren't you the kid from Family Affair?" was a brutal form of public shaming. It forced him to violently confront the impossible chasm between his past manufactured glory and his present undeniable degradation. He had to endure the warm childhood nostalgia in a stranger's eyes rapidly curdling into pity or disgust. The character of Jody, the cheerful boy who had provided comfort to a nation, became a constant mocking reminder of the love and security he had pantomimed on screen, but was entirely denied in his actual life. Throughout the entire decade of the 1990s, whilst his former child star peers were either successfully establishing adult careers, transitioning behind the camera, or simply vanishing into a comfortable, wealthy obscurity, Johnny was fighting a daily, brutal hand-to-hand war for survival on the concrete. The physical toll of long-term, uninterrupted substance abuse is medically catastrophic. The internal organs bear the brunt of the relentless chemical assault. The immune system collapses under the strain of malnutrition and exposure, and the brain's chemistry is fundamentally, perhaps permanently, rewired, making the very concept of joy or peace impossible without a synthetic catalyst. For a decade, his severe addiction played out in plain sight on the streets of Los Angeles. His family, deeply fractured by the financial disputes of his teenage years, the trauma of his divorce, and likely exhausted by the collateral damage and manipulation that inherently accompanies severe addiction, were largely estranged. In the grim survivalist calculus of severe drug addiction, relationships cease to be emotional bonds. They become merely resources to be mined for drug money, shelter, or access to the substance. Once the trust is entirely broken and the resources are depleted, the addict is left in a state of absolute terrifying isolation. He was surrounded by other users in the SQ, wats and alleys of Los Angeles, but there is no true community or loyalty in a drug den. There is only a shared proximity to the substance and a mutual willingness to exploit one another for the next hit. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost haunting the extreme margins of society, a depreciated, expired asset that the world, the industry, and seemingly his own family had written off as a total, irrecoverable loss. He had become the ultimate collateral damage of the golden age of television. A boy traded for Nielsen ratings, now a man traded for narcotics, waiting in the shadows for a final curtain call that seemed destined to arrive, not with applause, but with the silent, anonymous zip of a coroner's body bag. By the late 1990s, the world had violently accelerated towards a new digital millennium, entirely disconnected from the analog nostalgia of the past. Johnny, however, was hopelessly trapped in the rotting amber of his own history, a ghost haunting the sun-bleached alleys of a city that had long forgotten his childhood laughter. He had reached the terminal stage of his 12-year descent, the horrifying mathematical point in severe addiction where the narcotics no longer provided a euphoric synthetic escape or even numbing relief. They merely served as a desperate baseline biological requirement to stave off the agonizing, bone-crushing sickness of acute withdrawal. His physical body, the very vessel that had once been insured by major television networks for millions of dollars, and adored by a global audience, was systematically failing him under the sheer weight of a decade of chemical abuse. The physical deterioration was impossible to ignore or conceal beneath the grime of the streets. His liver, his heart, and the fragile, delicate chemistry of his brain had been pushed far beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. He was not just living on borrowed time, he was living on stolen, highly toxic time, and the physiological debt he had accrued at over a decade of chemical abuse was finally, violently about to be called in. It was in this state of absolute abject wretchedness, standing on the very threshold of an anonymous, unmourned death, that the remaining fractured fragments of his deeply damaged ecosystem finally mobilized. They did not gather out of a nostalgic desire to resurrect a dead Hollywood career, nor did they come together to salvage a lost family fortune. They mobilized out of a desperate, primal, and exhausted need to prevent the imminent creation of a corpse. The intervention that took place to save Johnny Whitaker's life was not the polished, softly lit, and therapeutically guided affair one might see broadcast on a modern reality television program where wealthy, insulated celebrities are gently coaxed into luxury rehabilitation centers overlooking the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. Johnny was entirely bankrupt, completely stripped of both financial resources and spiritual reserves. The intervention was a grim, desperate, and deeply painful collision of unhealed past traumas and horrifying present realities. The family dynamic, which had been so thoroughly shattered by the bitter legal disputes over his childhood earnings and the toxic, radioactive fallout of his Hollywood years, was forced into a temporary, incredibly fragile ceasefire. Blood, even blood that has been irreversibly tainted by lawsuits, financial betrayal, and decades of estrangement, carries a stubborn, undeniable gravity when faced with the absolute, irreversible finality of a family member's death. Those who remained in his orbit, the relatives who had watched the heavily exploited boy of the 1960s deteriorate into the hollowed-out vagrant of the 1990s, gathered to deliver a message that offered absolutely no compromise or negotiation. They cornered the man who had once been Jody, ruthlessly stripping away the last chemically induced defenses of his addicted mind to present a strict choice. See between immediate inpatient rehabilitation or total permanent abandonment. The ultimatum delivered to Johnny was not a plea for his health. It was a psychological guillotine, a blood ultimatum that left no room for manipulation. The terms were brutally clear, articulated with the cold, hard, and terrifying precision of people who have entirely exhausted every last reservoir of empathy, patience, and financial support. They told him, looking into the hollow, sunken eyes of a man they barely recognized, that they were unconditionally done. They were done financing his slow-motion suicide. They were done watching him degrade and destroy himself on the merciless streets of Los Angeles. And they were done waiting in terror for the inevitable midnight phone call from the county coroner's office. The choice presented to him was binary, absolute, and chilling. He would either immediately enter an inpatient rehabilitation facility and submit entirely to the agonizing, terrifying process of getting clean, or he would be cut off forever, erased from their lives with the stroke of a pen. They would change their phone numbers, they would lock their doors, they would legally disown him, and they would consider him dead before his heart actually stopped beating. If he chose the needle over this final frayed lifeline, he would die completely alone in the gutter, and they would not come to identify or claim his body. For a man whose entire foundational childhood trauma was deeply rooted in the transactional, conditional nature of love, the devastating realization as a toddler that adult affection was inextricably tied to his commercial performance, and the soul-crushing realization as an adult that loyalty could be casually discarded by a wife and a best friend, this threat of total, permanent, and absolute abandonment was the most terrifying, effective weapon they could have possibly wielded. It targeted the deepest, most unhealed, and most vulnerable wound in his shattered psyche. For a 12-year addict, this blood ultimatum meant facing the sudden loss of his only coping mechanism. Johnny was being asked, under the threat of total excommunication, to surrender the one substance that had kept him alive. The narcotics were undoubtedly destroying his internal organs and his dignity, but they were also the only barrier standing between his conscious waking mind and the unbearable crushing weight of his objective reality. To get clean meant he would have to face the entirety of his memories completely sober. He would have to feel the visceral, burning humiliation of his divorce, the bitter, unresolved sting of his family's alleged financial betrayals, and the profound, existential, suffocating grief of a stolen, monetized childhood, entirely without any chemical buffer to dull the agony. It is a prospect so psychologically horrifying, so daunting to a chronic addict, that death often seems like the softer, more rational, and more peaceful alternative. Yet in that pivotal, excruciating moment, backed into a corner and looking into the hardened eyes of the people who are offering him a final, highly conditional reprieve, a microscopic, deeply buried spark of the old Johnny Whitaker flickered to life in the darkness. Perhaps it was the sheer, bone-deep, terminal exhaustion of the daily hustle for survival. Perhaps it was the lingering, fundamental, biological desire to simply live, an evolutionary imperative buried beneath years of relentless self-destruction. Or perhaps deep down, he simply did not want his final, enduring legacy to be a nameless, forgotten toe tag in a sterile Los Angeles morgue, an anonymous, pathetic end to a life that had begun under the brightest, most expensive studio lights in the world. Whatever the internal catalyst may have been, the boy who had been rigorously trained since the age of 3 to follow direction, to hit his designated mark, and to do exactly what the adults told him to do, surrendered to the demands. He agreed to walk into the fire. The physical transition from the chaotic, unregulated survivalism of the streets to the rigid clinical environment of a rehabilitation facility is a violent, traumatic shock to the biological system. A detox ward is not a sanctuary. It is a sterile, fluorescent-lit battlefield where the human body goes to war with itself. The facility Johnny entered was entirely stripped of any lingering Hollywood glamour or comfort. It was an unforgiving environment defined by linoleum floors, bolted furniture, and rigid, unyielding, non-negotiable schedules. In a cruel parallel, the architecture of rehab closely mirrors the rigid structure of a television soundstage. Once again, Johnny was placed in an environment where his personal autonomy was completely revoked. He was told exactly when to wake up, when to eat, when to speak in group therapy, and when to sleep. He was constantly surrounded by strangers who monitored, charted, and judged his every physical and emotional move. But this time, there were no television cameras capturing his performance. There were no adoring fans waiting outside for an autograph. And there was absolutely no multi-million-dollar paycheck waiting for him at the end of the production schedule. The only product being manufactured in this clinical factory was his own basic biological survival. He was stripped of his street clothes, his meager possessions, and whatever chemical contraband he had desperately tried to hide, reduced to a fragile, shivering, highly vulnerable organism forced to confront the absolute unvarnished wreckage of its own existence. When a body saturated with heavy narcotics for over a decade is suddenly denied those substances, the central nervous system rebounds with violent intensity. Johnny endured the classic, grueling, and dangerous hallmarks of severe late-stage withdrawal. His body temperature fluctuated wildly and uncontrollably between freezing, bone-rattling chills and pooling, feverish, foul-smelling sweat. His muscles, starved of the opiates that had relaxed them, cramped and spasmed with a localized pain that felt as though his very bones were being splintered and ground down from the inside out. The gastrointestinal nausea was relentless, a constant heaving, violent sickness that purged his stomach until there was nothing left to expel but bitter bile and stomach acid. Sleep, the one refuge he desperately craved to escape the physical torture, was entirely impossible. His brain, misfiring wildly and starved of the artificial chemicals it had come to rely on for basic, everyday function, produced terrifying, hyper-realistic, and deeply paranoid hallucinations and nightmares whenever he dared to close his eyes, forcing him to remain awake in a state of hyper-vigilant trembling and profound exhaustion. He was trapped in a physical, inescapable prison of his own making, paying the agonizing physiological toll with interest for 12 years of synthetic oblivion. Every cell in his body screamed for the poison that was killing him, and for weeks, his only job was to endure the screaming without answering it. But the physical agony of detox, horrific and life-threatening as it is merely the biological overture to the true, enduring nightmare of psychological recovery. The human body can be cleansed of chemical toxins in a matter of weeks, but the mind requires a much longer, much more dangerous, and much more painful excavation. As the thick protective chemical fog slowly began to lift from Johnny's battered brain, The muted emotions and deeply buried traumas came roaring back to the surface of his consciousness with the destructive, unstoppable force of a tsunami. Without the drugs and the alcohol to suppress them, he was violently forced to process decades of psychological damage, betrayal, and humiliation all at once. He had to stand in front of the mirror, under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the facility bathroom, and confront the haggard, prematurely aged, and deeply scarred man staring back at him. He had to actively mourn the boy he used to be, the boy whose innocent smile had enchanted a nation, but who had been systematically, ruthlessly dismantled by the adults and the industry tasked with his care. He had to sit in sterile, uncomfortable group therapy circles, surrounded by other broken, desperate people, and attempt to articulate the specific, bizarre, and profoundly alienating humiliation of being a discarded, financially exploited child star. How does one accurately explain the trauma of having one's childhood commodified, merchandised, and broadcast to millions, to an audience of people who are recovering from poverty, domestic abuse, or gang violence? The isolation of his specific gilded grief was profound. He had to navigate the towering resentment he felt towards the industry that had chewed him up and spat him out the moment he hit puberty, the family that had allegedly viewed his childhood as a bottomless bank account, and the wife who had shattered his final desperate illusion of safety. It was a daily, excruciating, and exhausting exercise in facing the absolute worst aspects of his life, his failures, and his victimhood, entirely without the ability to look away or numb the pain. This initial phase of sobriety is the crucible where many addicts falter, unable to withstand the blinding, searing, unmitigated pain of a stark reality. The temptation to walk out the front door of the facility to find a familiar dealer on a familiar corner, and to wrap himself back in the warm, suffocating, familiar blanket of heroin must have been a constant, deafening roar in his ears. Every exposed nerve ending demanded relief. The therapeutic process required him to completely dismantle the fragile, defensive, and cynical ego he had constructed to survive the streets, and to attempt to rebuild a new, authentic identity from the scattered rubble. He had to learn how to exist, not as Jody, the fictional television orphan, not as the famous, wealthy Johnny Whitaker, and not as the anonymous, desperate Skid Row junkie, but simply as a man. He had to painstakingly reconstruct basic human coping mechanisms that he had never been allowed to develop in his youth, having bypassed normal adolescence entirely in favor of sound stages, promotional tours, and, later, drug dens. It was an infantilizing, deeply humbling, and terrifying psychological process. He was a middle-aged man having to learn how to process disappointment, anger, boredom, and sadness for the very first time in his life, without reaching for a chemical catalyst. The ultimatum delivered by his family hung over this entire grueling process as a constant lethal threat. It was the harsh, unforgiving, and rigid framework that kept him physically tethered to the recovery program during the dark hours when his own internal willpower completely evaporated. He knew, with absolute certainty, that failure was not just a temporary relapse. It was an execution of his remaining familial ties and a guarantee of his own physical demise. The highly conditional nature of this support eerily mirrored the conditional love of his childhood, a tragic poetic symmetry that he was now forced to analyze and accept in order to survive. He had to untangle the twisted, corrupted wires of his past, separating the boy who genuinely loved to act from the product that was mercilessly exploited, separating the family he loved from the managers who had failed him financially, It was a psychological surgery performed entirely without anesthetic, requiring him to cut away the necrotic tissue of his past resentments to save whatever healthy flesh remained. He had to accept the most bitter pill of all, that the millions of dollars he had earned as a child were gone forever, that the golden years of Disney premieres and CBS ratings were never coming back, and that Hollywood would never issue an apology for stealing high. His youth, he had to realize that the only victory available to him now was the quiet, unglamorous, and invisible triumph of simply waking up, facing the day, and staying sober for another 24 hours. He was no longer fighting for top billing or a higher salary. He was fighting a trench war for the basic privilege of being ordinary. Through a combination of sheer, stubborn endurance, the terrifying leverage of the ultimatum, and a profound fundamental shift in his own spiritual perspective, Johnny Whitaker achieved the impossible. He did not die in the streets. He completed the rehabilitation program. He walked out of the facility not as a conquering hero, but as a fragile, damaged survivor, carrying the heavy, permanent scars of a war that had spanned over 3 decades. The journey from the peak of child stardom to the absolute nadir of severe addiction, and finally to the quiet shores of sustained recovery, is a trajectory that breaks almost everyone who attempts it. The child stars who survive this specific brutal gauntlet do not return to their former lives. They are reborn into a completely different reality. For Johnny, the resurrection did not involve a triumphant return to the silver screen. There was no massive comeback role waiting for him, no red carpet redemption arc orchestrated by a sympathetic studio. The industry that had created him, profited immensely from him, and discarded him remained entirely indifferent to his survival. They had moved on to the next generation of disposable, wide-eyed children, feeding the same insatiable machine. Faced with the reality of his survival, Johnny made a choice that defied the expected trajectory of his tragic life. He did not retreat into bitter obscurity, nor did he spend his remaining years fruitlessly suing the ghosts of his past for the money he had lost. Instead, he took the absolute worst, most agonizing experiences of his life, the 12 years of chemical slavery, the homelessness, the betrayal, and the psychological destruction, and weaponized them for the benefit of others. The product that was systematically broken by the Hollywood machine became the very tool used to fix others who had been broken by the world. Johnny Whitaker became a certified drug and alcohol addiction counselor. He returned to the very same dark, desperate trenches he had just crawled out of, not as a victim, but as a guide. He sat in sterile rooms, much like the ones he had recovered in, and looked into the hollow, terrified eyes of other addicts, offering them the only currency that matters in recovery: absolute, unfiltered empathy born of shared suffering. He could speak to the high-profile executives who had lost everything to cocaine, and he could speak to the street-level addicts who had lost everything to heroin, because he had intimately lived both extremes of that horrifying spectrum. He used his unique, bizarre history not as a crutch, but as a bridge to connect with people who believed they were entirely beyond saving. Johnny ultimately conquered the drugs and reclaimed his autonomy, becoming a certified addiction counselor. He never recovered the squandered millions he had traded his youth for, nor did he return to the spotlight. Yet, he achieved a victory far more enduring, surviving the very machine designed to consume him. While the fictional Jody remains frozen in television syndication, the real Johnny Whitaker walked away. His true legacy is not found in the archives of CBS or Disney, but in the unglamorous, vital rooms of addiction recovery, proving that while the industry may extract a child's youth, it does not have to own their ending.